Thanks a lot, Maria. Thanks a lot to Gidas. Thanks a lot to CRPM. This is a great pleasure and honor to be here today. You're right, it started about 10 years ago, and I'll talk a little bit about this. ESI has worked on Macedonia for now 14 years almost, and it's always been a great pleasure to come back here. Some of the people who have enabled us to come back here are in the room. First of all, of course, my colleagues and analysts, Egert Harten, Max Lamberson. Some of our donors, the Open Society Think Tank Fund, the Dutch Foreign Ministry, but especially, I hope, some of our readers. And so what I will do today is give a few ideas and a few thoughts on the topic you've raised. Now, Gidas, in the first invitation I was sent, I read that I was supposed to speak for 1.5 hours. In the next invitation I read that it was only 45 minutes. And yesterday when I talked at the university, before I started talking, Gidas said that there is scientific research that people only remember 25 minutes. So I will try to actually be short, because I understand that afterwards there is a reception on the terrace. But I have three topics. And let me start with a few personal reflections. When lightning strikes. This is how ESI started in Macedonia. This is my colleague Christoph Bender. This is in 12 years ago, and we had this very young, very serious, studious, hardworking, taciturn, not speaking a lot researcher, Gidas, with my colleague with my colleague Christoph. And then we had this seminar in winter 2004, a seminar to try to inspire some Macedonians to set up think tanks. And we stopped after the seminar because it was so successful. 3 think tanks were created after this by 3 different people, and all 3 still exist today. The most successful and the biggest one, however, has a very interesting story. You see this woman there on the side with her telephone. She was one of the people who stood out at the seminar, constantly on the phone, constantly organizing things. And there were interesting, strange things happening there. And one of the strangest things was what happened to our lead researcher, Gidas. Check out this picture. Gidas had been always very, serious and scholarly, but at the seminar, it was like lightning struck him. He started becoming very extravagant, drawing attention to himself. And as we can see when we zoom in on this picture, the lady on his side appeared to like it. I didn't know, but they hadn't met before. They actually met at the seminar and then decided after this to not only set up a think tank, but to also set up a family. And we never topped this. We did capacity building 10 times in Tunisia, in Georgia, in Baku, in Kiev, but we never again gave rise to such a productive union. Gidas hasn't actually changed much, I realized. I mean, ever since lightning struck him and he realized it's important for think tankers to be noticed. And it's no good being an academic when you're in the think tank world. You have to be noticed. Yesterday, I was giving a talk at the university. Gidas was chairing, and as I was making my points on the future of EU progress reports, this is how Gidas looked at me. So I think you've created something that is quite remarkable. 10 years later, you are still around. I don't know if Gidas has changed at all. 10 years later, you're still around. You're still a productive couple, but you have a big team. You are indeed one of the biggest think tanks in the region, and you are making an impact on policy. And so as being marginally involved at the very beginning, just getting you introduced, all the rest, I think the dynamics between you created, we are very proud, all of us, and we want to congratulate you as well. Now, one little, yes. One short reflection, since this is about a think tank that has been around for 10 years, and many of us are from think tanks, about the idea and the question when think tanks make a difference. You've raised it already. Now, there are 3 things I think that all successful think tanks have in common and that they need to make a success. One is indeed to find ways to stand out, to be remembered for what they produce. There's so much being written nowadays. There's so much on the internet. There's such a noise of opinions and analysis that actually I always talk to my colleagues about this thing, that we always forget how much of most of what we learn about is actually forgotten very, very quickly. This is an interesting curve. After 2 days, you only remember 20% of what you've heard, if at all. So whatever I say now, if I manage to capture your attention, well, perhaps 20% you'll still know 2 days from now, and then much less. Now, this is not only true for what people say, it's also true for people who read. There's a wonderful little French book, I don't know if you've read it. It says How to Talk About Books You Have Not Read. It's by a French literature professor. He thinks that the best conversations about books are actually between two people who haven't read them. And he also explains that there are different forms of not reading. And one of the most famous and useful form of not reading is you read and forget, which is actually what we do all the time. I mean, ask yourself, what do you remember of books you read 3 years ago? Now, this is especially a problem for think tanks, because we work hard, we do the research, we produce little papers. First, we need to get people to open it. That's one way of not reading, not to open the book. But the other challenge is to get them to remember. Now, one thing we've been trying to do in order to solve this problem is to have catchy titles, like this one, Caviar Diplomacy. We wrote a report about Macedonia, which was called Ahmeti's Village, which also, I think some people, certainly Mr. Ahmeti and some of the other people we described remembered. We wrote about Turkey and Islamic Calvinists in central Anatolia. And we wrote about Bosnia as the European Raj, the British Empire in Bosnia, and the High Representative. But having catchy titles is not really enough unless you have a good text. Now, the second thing that is key, I think, and this is now getting us back into politics, is to be clear and crisp. This morning I had a discussion with some EU ambassadors, and our topic was EU policy towards the Balkans. And in fact, we were looking at the EU progress reports. Now, EU progress reports, as many of you will know, are not easy reading. In fact, we analyzed some of the sections and decided that probably nobody had read them, because they simply didn't make much sense. I mean, the economic section in particular. Go back, I won't bore you here, go back or read our reports on this, to the 8 pages on the economy in the 2013 EU Progress Report on Macedonia. It's gobbledygook, which is the word for the strange sound some animals make. It is incomprehensible. There are many problems with this, but it has a political implication. If people don't understand the assessments of progress, if the EU isn't clear in what it is actually demanding, praising, or criticizing, if it appears that this is all purely discretionary, arbitrary, if it is not clear and crisp, then the politics suffers, reforms suffer. The credibility of one of the great mobilizing ideas in European politics suffers. So we have been advocating very strongly recently for a dramatic change and reform in the way these assessments are written. But this is also true for think tanks. As one famous New York Times editor once wrote, there are many ways to write badly. The usual way is to make sentences that do not say what you think. And there's only one way to write well, which is that most sentences you make have to be killed and the rest has to be fixed. And I think you've been successful in this. I've been looking at some of your reports that what actually distinguishes them, and I think what has enabled you to get donors for all this period, is that you have found a very clear way of writing. Now, the core principle is that there is no excuse for losing readers, and this gets me back to the EU. There really isn't an excuse for the EU, not only in Macedonia, but throughout Southeast Europe, to have become so unclear about what it is actually demanding. Because this not only causes the EU to lose support in the region, it also causes it to lose support among its own voters. There has been a dramatic collapse in confidence in EU enlargement policy in EU publics. If you look at opinion polls in the last 5 years, today of 15 EU members, all EU member states, 11 have more than 50% of the population who told Eurobarometer that they are opposed to enlargement. Now, to put it in context, 5 years ago it was only 4. So there is a trend. Not in any EU country has enlargement become more popular. In some countries, it has become dramatically more unpopular, including countries like Spain or the Czech Republic. Now, here's the challenge for think tanks. Here's my challenge with you. In the age of mobile communication, it's very easy to tune out. I don't know what the guy is saying, but obviously people don't pay much attention. So how do you, and how does the EU prevent this happening on a larger scale? Well, dealing with think tanks is one way of solving the problem. I think the best role for think tanks is to be connectors and translators. Connectors and translators of important experiences.
Now, we've recently written a report on this city. This is a western town in western Romania, Timișoara. We wrote a little report, we did a film on it, where we were investigating the paradox that this city has 1% unemployment. We interviewed a mayor who said the big problem to get investors to come to Timișoara today is that everybody who leaves university immediately has a job. There is no labor available. Now, what is interesting, I think, about this moment in Macedonia's history, and what I think is a challenge for a country that is still very isolated compared to the rest of Europe, is to look for the experiences outside. I mean, this is a key role to connect and to translate those experiences. Experiences like Romania's ability to attract substantial foreign direct investment and make structural changes in the economy. Experiences like Estonia or Poland to, in a very short period of time, dramatically increase English language capacity of its students. Experiences from everywhere in Europe, including, we recently wrote something about Finland and Macedonia, including debates on education. Because, of course, as you know, education is the key to the future. And if we look at Macedonia, it has, the last time it took a PISA assessment test, which is the OECD test to measure what 14-year-olds are capable of doing with what they've learned in school. The last time it took it in 2000, the results were dramatic. I mean, dramatic. And I'm very glad to hear that now it's being taken again for the first time this year. But I think what think tanks can do is to go around Europe to other small countries, like Finland, like Estonia, like the Scandinavian countries, of course, to look at experiences and translate them back into the local debate. I think this is why the golden age of think tanks really ought to be the 10 years before EU accession. This is when policymakers need, and society needs new ideas most. Now, learning from success also means busting some myths. I mean, one of the myths I've come across when we did interviews recently here in Macedonia is that all of Europe is in economic crisis and there's very little you can do about this. Well, I mean, fortunately there are some statistics. One of the interesting things is if you look at the convergence in the last 10 years, I mean, these are really quite extraordinary numbers. This covers already most of the crisis from 2008 to 2012. It shows us EU 28 is 100 GDP per capita, purchasing power. Now Estonia has, look at this, 24%. I mean, this is cutting short by 50% the distance. Lithuania, Poland, Romania, even Bulgaria, which compared to the others was somewhat slower. Poland, of course, famously went through the recent crisis without a recession. Now, why is this important? Because in this country, too, there are lots of people who say, well, okay, we are stuck on the EU path, but perhaps it doesn't matter so much. We are anyways doing better than, let's say, our neighbors. Well, I mean, it's not true. It's just not true. I mean, Bulgaria has been doing better than Macedonia in economic terms, but why compare yourself to the lowest? Look at Romania, look at Poland, look at the Baltic states. Now, these kinds of experiences allow you as a think tank to not fall into the Muppet trap. I mean, countries with lots of intelligent people and high levels of frustration very easily fall into the trap where most intellectuals are commenting snidely about what doesn't work, what isn't possible, and why things can't be done. I think what is great about Europe is that it's a laboratory of experiences. You can go out and look for success. At the same time, looking at real experiences and case studies allows you not to fall into the cheerleader trap either. Whether it is for a government or for a process, whether it is for EU enlargement or for an institution, it is always a danger that if you believe in something strongly, you end up being a cheerleader, not an analyst. So realistic assessments, experiences from elsewhere, translated into a local context. I think this is the key challenge that all small and relatively closed societies in the Balkans face today. And this is why I think tanks like CRPM and others are so crucial at this moment and should be supported. Now, we did actually work together on one big issue. You reminded me with your nice picture, which was visa liberalization. Now, I will be saying a few critical things about how I see Macedonia today, so let me start with a success, a recent one, which is visa liberalization. Now, what was interesting about this process was that here the EU did something unusual. It defined very clear and precise conditions, 45. But secondly, it gave every country the same conditions. Now, this was very useful because it allowed EU experts from the Commission and Member States to come and compare countries in detail, to write transparent assessments, which think tanks could, I mean, we, at that time actually, we leaked, they were leaked to us and we put them on the website, but today they are all transparent for the visa processes, so think tanks can compare them. Now what is interesting was this allowed us to, for example, show that in 2009, Macedonia was the front runner in the region, better than Serbia, better than Montenegro, far better than Albania or Bosnia in meeting the conditions. And this enabled the Commission to persuade skeptical EU interior ministers to grant visa liberalization in a very short period. Now we worked together on this. We had a network of research institutes in the Balkans, very interesting people. The Albanian partner at that time is now the foreign minister. And I think for all of us involved in this, there is an inspirational idea. It is that when the EU finally finds a way to clearly define criteria and is strict and fair, it doesn't actually give any discounts. Bosnia and Albania did not get visa liberalization when they hadn't met the conditions. To be strict, to be clear, to be fair, to be meritocratic, it is good for everyone, and especially it is good for reform. So this was the end picture. Now, to see Macedonians, Serbs, Montenegrins in 2009 celebrate that finally they had visa liberalization was a moment of real hope. We all thought now things will take off. We all know they did not. But at this short moment in the theme of the Balkans and Europe, Macedonia actually became a model. I went with this young man, he was then the Deputy Prime Minister of Macedonia, former Deputy Prime Minister, to Moldova, to see the Prime Minister of Moldova in 2010, right after Macedonia's visas were lifted, to explain to the Macedonian government, Moldovan government, sorry, you can do that too. At that time, Moldovans were very skeptical, but in 3 days we met everybody, all the ministers, the parliament, the media. We said, look, if Macedonia can do it, learn from them. They did actually learn from Macedonia. They came here, they talked to CRPM, the think tanks learned from Macedonia, and of course, as you might have heard, 2 months ago, Moldova got visa-free travel, the biggest success in Moldovan EU policy. This is interesting. Here was a policy that worked for the EU, that worked for Macedonia, and that made Macedonia an inspiration for other Europeans. And one almost has to say this again. Macedonia was, a few years ago, an inspiration for other Europeans. The problem is that since then, things have not gone quite as well as we would have expected. Now, there is a conventional explanation why things have stopped. The conventional explanation is it's all the fault of Greece. Right, so the Commission has recommended for 5 years Macedonia should start talks. Talks haven't started. So rather like, the two persons waiting for Godot and he never arrives, the EU train and the EU process has never started. This is the dialogue from Waiting for Godot. You have Estragon, you have basically the two tramps. Estragon saying to Vladimir, let's go. Vladimir saying, we can't. Estragon saying, why not? And Vladimir saying, we're waiting for Godot. Godot being, in this case, the European Union. So the European Union isn't coming. There's very little we can do. Now let me try to sum up some of our findings that we've made in the last year as we travel around Macedonia and talk to a large number of people, from the Prime Minister to the mayors to very critical journalists, mayors in the west and in the east of the country, business people and others, about how the EU is seen today in Macedonia. And in order to do that, actually, let me transform a little and represent two personalities. One, Vladimir the Macedonian, and the other, Estragon. Now, Vladimir the Macedonian is now explaining his views, and I think you will recognize some of them. The EU is not fair to Macedonia. The EU has never been fair to Macedonia. All right, I've been voting VMRO for the last 3 years, or the last 3 elections. But I'm not a nationalist. What I see is that in 1991, when Macedonia emerged as an independent state, in 1991, the EU did not follow its own commission, the Bud Intercommission, and recognize us. And since then, it's been the same story every time. For 25 years, the EU has been led around like a bear by the nose by the Greeks. Now, the real problem with the Greeks is that their personnel hasn't changed. So in 1991, it was Mr. Samaras who told us that Macedonia was an unviable state. Mr. Samaras then became the Minister of Culture. In 2008, he told the Greek media that, again, Macedonia is an unviable state, and now he's the Prime Minister. So what are we to do? There is very little we can do, and it's deeply unfair. But the European Union, instead of looking at itself and putting pressure on the Greeks, has decided to put pressure on us. It is creating a story that we're not a full democracy. Well, we are not a full democracy, but let's compare ourselves fairly to our neighbors. Are we truly worse than Montenegro, which still has the former communists in power and never had a change in government? Are we truly worse than Kosovo, which is run by the former UČK? You all know who's in power in Serbia, perhaps the EU has forgotten, but this is, of course, the former radical party, not to mention what we see in Turkey on the television screens. The way Mr. Erdogan, who is negotiating and who is an EU candidate and who has been opening chapters, is treating opposition, I think suggests that EU standards are not consistent. If we would have an election law here, like in Hungary, VMRO would get 80% of the Macedonian votes. Now, we've done what the EU has told us on inter-ethnic relations. In the Ohrid Agreement, it says this would be part of the Euro-Atlantic integration process, but it hasn't happened. Our economy is doing fine, at least as fine as we can do, without outside support. The World Bank praises us. We have a great business climate. The IMF says we are doing good things. Of course we are not rich, but how can we be rich without the money that the EU gives to Bulgaria and Greece? Now, we don't have far-right movements like the Golden Dawn in Greece or Jobbik in Hungary. And when it comes to the media, yes, we are not perfect, but who is? Is Italy perfect, which Freedom House considered only partially free? Now, what I see when I look at Europe is basically a union that is a bully. Now, I want to still join because I don't want to be bullied, but there's nothing that we can do. The EU cannot bully Turkey, but it bullies us. It tells us we are not meeting conditions, but these conditions are not the same for everyone. I'm no longer angry, but I'm sad. I just want to be treated like everybody else. Now, let me... No. This wasn't me. Let me now go to Estragon, who is a disappointed supporter of the whoever. He strongly believes in the EU and is a disappointed supporter of anybody who's been strongly in favor of the EU. Now, Estragon's view is, and he says to Vladimir, "Dear Vladimir, things are actually a lot worse than you make them out to be. I agree with you that the EU is unfair. But if the EU is a bully, if you're right, then why are we behaving so irrationally? I mean, if we are small and weak, why do we put our finger in the eyes of our neighbors? Is it really worthwhile to provoke the Greeks since 2006 by renaming every street and every highway and putting up statues of Alexander the Great everywhere? No, I don't mind putting up statues. I just ask whether it's a wise policy. Now, inter-ethnic relations, you're right, they are better than at the time of war. But I don't actually want to live in a country where there are two ethnic one-party states and stagnation is built into the political situation. It is a stagnation that kills us. You talk about the economy. Which other country in the Balkans has seen so little foreign direct investment, so consistently high or low employment rates? Now in the media, I don't care what the situation is in Turkey. I only care about Macedonia. And the situation is bad. Everybody agrees on this. The OSCE Commissioner for the Media says it. The UN Commissioner for the Media says it. Reporters Without Borders say it. Freedom House say it. Only the European Commission doesn't say it. Read the last progress report. There the Commission lists a whole range of meaningless reforms, organizing speak-out conferences, and then in Macedonia, as the ODIHR pointed out in an objective study after the last elections, even at election time, you only hear one voice. Now this is typical. The EU says it has principles, but when it comes to defending them in Macedonia, it doesn't do so, perhaps because it has a bad conscience. Now look at gay rights. This was part of the conditions for visa liberalization. And yet, if you turn on Macedonian television, hate speech wherever you look, and no reaction from the authorities. Now, the economic success story I've already talked about. And as for our statistics, well, we don't know how many people live here. We don't know how many people work for the government. We don't really know our GDP. We can't really believe anything. And if I read the progress report of the Commission, none of this is even mentioned. My problem is that the Commission is too soft. My problem as a European Democrat is that I had put my faith in European values, but I see that the source of these values, Brussels, doesn't defend them strongly enough. I feel betrayed. You say you're sad. I'm desperate. You never really believed in the EU, did you? Because in the end, it is an issue of pragmatism. But I believed in the values, and I feel like an orphan. So what we see, he also complains about this thing. Why do you put up a statue for people blowing up buildings? Terrorists. What is this going to say to the European Union or to your own citizens, that you have these as heroes in your central square? So here's the problem. In a way, you find both Vladimir and Estragon have some points. But what they have in common is that both of them believe that the EU process today has become arbitrary. It's no longer tied to clear standards. That when the EU says you're doing fine, or when the EU says you're not doing fine, you no longer know who to believe. So in a way, what Vladimir and Estragon share with the European publics in the Netherlands and Germany, who also question the assessments of the Commission, is that they believe it's all become a political process. And here, I leave you with a thought for how you might get out of this situation. Because what we've seen has worked in the past, and the only thing that has worked has been clarity on standards. So I think the European Union is not doing anybody a favor. It's not helping Macedonia. It's not helping the government, it's not helping the opposition, it's not helping civil society, and it's not helping the businesses. If it doesn't spell out strict, clear, fair and transparent conditions. Now, who can do that? Not the member states. Because when they sit together, it is politics. It has to be politics. They are accountable to their governments. Cyprus, Greece, France, Austria, depending on the country, will always play some politics. But the institution that has to do it, that has to be objective, and that has to be the standard setter for assessments, has to be the European Commission. This worked for visa liberalization. It can work again for other areas. And if it works, then civil society can mobilize around this. If we actually have European standards that are clearly defined for what is acceptable and what is unacceptable in the field of the media, what is acceptable and unacceptable in the field of gay rights, what is required to meet EU standards when it comes to procurement, or environment, or food safety, or public administration, in the different institutions the EU acquis foresees a country has functioning according to EU standards. Once we have them clearly spelled out, you have a very different debate. So what I think we need to do, the think tanks in the region and the think tanks in Europe, is to take the current crisis of confidence, these dialogues I've been presenting, very seriously. Because these people, Estragon and Vladimir, are not just Macedonians. They could also be Turks or Bosnians. There are many people in Turkey who think exactly the same thing. Either the EU is always going to be unfair, or in fact the EU is not defending its standards strong enough because Turkey is too important. Either way you lose. You hear similar things today in Bosnia, and I think you will hear them very soon in Serbia as well. So this is not actually a Macedonian crisis. It is a crisis of a policy. And I think, unless it is changed quickly, we are running into a real risk that the flag that we have behind us and the vision that it stands for will soon become very unreal. Now, will governments in the region like this if the EU follows these ideas, if the Commission spells out the conditions clearly? Well, perhaps not all of them, but I think overall they will do well. When I presented this idea to different Macedonian politicians, it was very interesting. They agreed on nothing, except that when I talked about this being essentially in the Macedonian interest, both leaders of the SDSM, your prime minister and the leader of DUI, said, yes, we would like that, for very different reasons. Some believed it would show Macedonia is doing better than the Europeans think. Others believe it would show that Macedonia is doing much worse. But this really doesn't matter. What matters is that you have a different debate, no longer on the formalities, but on the substance. So what we recommend, and I think if this is accepted, and let's push for it together, the job and the cooperation we had on visa would be expanded to many areas. What we are recommending is that the European Commission sets out clear roadmaps per policy area, per chapter, as soon as possible, applies them to all the countries in the Balkans, from Turkey to Albania, whether they negotiate or not, so that you can all compete on a level playing field. And when civil servants work hard in an area and achieve success, it is recognized, it helps you get investors, and you can begin over time change your image, not based on image campaigns, which never work, but based on credible substantive assessments. So let us not fall into the trap of Vladimir and Estragon. Let us not fall into the trap of not moving and waiting for Godot. I think this is a very crucial moment. And if we want to survive, or if we want the EU enlargement process to survive, all of us need to join forces. And with the new commissioner coming in a few months' time, before current policies lead to the total erosion of confidence, push for change. So here we are back at our seminar. I remember we talked about Europe quite a lot, and some things have happened. But fundamentally, if we look at the last 10 years, I'm not sure we can say about the EU-Macedonia process what we can say about CRPM. You know, you've been a success. This process, I think, has betrayed more hopes than it has fulfilled. Changing this will be the big challenge for the next 10 years.
Thank you.